My name is Isabella Marchetti, and the day my brother Marcus handed me a check for $3,000 and said, "Here's your share of Nona's worthless dirt patch," he had no idea he had just given away distribution contracts worth $47 million. What he also didn't know was that I had been secretly apprenticing under our grandmother for 15 years, learning every detail of the wine business he dismissed as playing in the garden. But that humiliation in the lawyer's office was only the beginning, because when I discovered what they had actually sold, the buyers were already preparing to demolish everything our family had built for 4 generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of February 14th began with the kind of biting Northern California wind that strips the last dignity from winter bare grapevines. I stood in the parking lot of Henderson and Associates Legal Services, clutching a manila folder containing documents I had never been allowed to see, watching my siblings emerge from matching luxury vehicles that seemed to mock the gravity of what we were about to finalize. Marcus stepped out of his silver Tesla wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, his expression carrying that familiar mixture of impatience and condescension that had defined our relationship since childhood. Behind him, my sister Sophia emerged from her white Range Rover, her designer heels clicking against the asphalt with the precision of someone who had never doubted her place in the world. Both of them moved with the confidence of people who had already decided the outcome of today's meeting before it began. I had driven my 8-year-old Honda Civic from my studio apartment in Sacramento, where I worked as a freelance agricultural consultant, barely earning enough to cover basic expenses while they built successful careers in technology and finance. The contrast between our circumstances had become a source of constant tension in our family, particularly after our grandmother's death 6 months earlier had left us to navigate the complex legacy of Bella Vista Vineyard. The vineyard had been in our family since 1924, when our great-grandfather Giuseppe Marchetti had purchased 47 acres of prime Sonoma County land, with money saved from working in the copper mines of Arizona. Through 4 generations, the property had been passed down through a complicated system of family agreements and informal understandings that had somehow managed to keep the land intact, despite numerous opportunities for profitable subdivision. Our grandmother, Elena Marchetti, had been the vineyard's guardian for the past 35 years, ever since our grandfather's death had left her as the sole caretaker of both the property and its traditions. She had spent decades nurturing the vines with an almost mystical understanding of soil conditions, weather patterns, and the subtle art of grape cultivation that seemed to transcend mere agricultural knowledge. I had been the only grandchild to show genuine interest in the vineyard's operations, spending countless summers and weekends learning from Nonna Elena, while Marcus and Sophia pursued more conventional paths toward professional success. They viewed my attachment to the vineyard as a romantic but impractical obsession that would eventually give way to more realistic career ambitions. What they had never understood was that my time at Bella Vista had not been casual hobby farming but rather intensive apprenticeship in a business they had never bothered to comprehend. While they saw rows of grapevines and aging equipment, I had learned to recognize the subtle indicators of soil health, vine productivity, and harvest timing that determined the difference between mediocre wine and exceptional vintages. The legal meeting had been scheduled to finalize the sale of Bella Vista Vineyard to Consolidated Agricultural Holdings, a development company that specialized in converting agricultural properties into residential subdivisions. Marcus and Sophia had negotiated the sale without consulting me, using power of attorney documents that Nonna Elena had signed during her final illness, when her judgment had been compromised by pain medication and the confusion that often accompanied her chemotherapy treatments. The sale price of $4.2 million had seemed reasonable to my siblings, who viewed it as a substantial windfall that would provide each of us with enough money to pay off debts and make significant improvements to our respective financial situations. They had presented the transaction as a practical necessity, arguing that maintaining the vineyard was financially unsustainable, and that liquidating the asset was the most responsible approach to managing our grandmother's estate. However, I had spent months reviewing financial records and property documents that revealed a far more complex situation than my siblings understood. The vineyard's apparent lack of profitability had been largely the result of our grandmother's deliberate strategy of reinvesting all revenue into land improvements, equipment upgrades, and long-term contracts that would not generate immediate returns, but would establish the foundation for extraordinary future growth. As we walked toward the building entrance, I tried once more to convince Marcus and Sophia to postpone the sale until we could conduct a more thorough analysis of the vineyard's true value. My research had revealed several elements of our grandmother's business operations that had not been disclosed in the initial estate evaluation, including distribution agreements and exclusive contracts that might significantly alter the property's worth. Marcus dismissed my concerns with the patronizing tone he had perfected during his years as a software executive. He reminded me that the buyer had already committed to the purchase price and that delaying the transaction would likely result in losing the sale entirely. He also pointed out that my background in agricultural consulting, while perhaps relevant to farming operations, did not qualify me to evaluate complex real estate transactions or business valuations. Sophia supported Marcus's position while maintaining the diplomatic facade she had developed during her career in investment banking. She acknowledged my emotional attachment to the vineyard but emphasized the importance of making financial decisions based on objective analysis rather than sentimental considerations. She assured me that the proceeds from the sale would provide all of us with opportunities to pursue our individual goals without the burden of maintaining an unprofitable agricultural operation. The morning fog was beginning to lift as we entered the law office, revealing glimpses of the rolling hills that surrounded the small town of Healdsburg. The landscape reminded me of countless mornings I had spent walking through the vineyard with Nona Elena, learning to read the subtle signs that indicated when grapes were approaching perfect ripeness, or when weather conditions might require protective measures to preserve the crop. Those memories felt particularly painful as we prepared to sign documents that would transfer ownership of Bella Vista Vineyard to strangers who viewed it merely as developable land, rather than a living legacy that had been carefully cultivated across 4 generations of family stewardship. The reception area of Henderson and Associates featured the kind of understated elegance that suggested both competence and discretion. Leather furniture, mahogany paneling, and carefully selected artwork created an atmosphere of professional authority that seemed designed to make clients feel confident about entrusting important decisions to the firm's expertise. Margaret Henderson, the estate attorney who had been handling our grandmother's affairs for the past decade, greeted us with the measured warmth of someone who understood that family business meetings often involved complex emotional dynamics that could complicate even straightforward legal procedures. Her silver hair and composed demeanor projected the kind of seasoned wisdom that came from years of helping families navigate difficult transitions. As we settled into the conference room, I noticed that Marcus and Sophia positioned themselves on one side of the table while I sat alone on the other side, a physical arrangement that seemed to symbolize the fundamental disagreement about how to handle our grandmother's legacy. The buyer's representatives had not yet arrived, providing a brief opportunity for final family discussion before the transaction became irreversible. I made one last attempt to present my concerns about the sale, explaining that my research had revealed several aspects of the vineyard's operations that had not been fully evaluated during the initial appraisal process. I mentioned distribution contracts, exclusive supplier agreements, and long-term commitments that might have substantial value beyond the basic real estate assessment. Marcus interrupted my presentation with visible frustration, pointing out that we had been discussing these issues for months without reaching any resolution. He emphasized that the buyer was expecting to complete the transaction today and that further delays would jeopardize our ability to secure the agreed-upon purchase price. The tension in the room was palpable when the buyer's representatives arrived precisely at the scheduled time. James Morrison, the acquisitions director for Consolidated Agricultural Holdings, was accompanied by 2 associates who immediately began arranging contracts and supporting documents across the conference table. Morrison's confident demeanor and expensive clothing suggested someone accustomed to completing significant transactions with minimal complications. Margaret Henderson began reviewing the sale documents methodically, explaining each section and ensuring that all parties understood their respective obligations and rights under the agreement. The process felt surreal, as though we were participating in some elaborate ceremony that would transform decades of family history into a simple financial transaction. When Henderson reached the portion of the contract that specified the 3-way division of proceeds, Morrison produced 3 separate checks that had been prepared in advance. Marcus and Sophia each received checks for approximately $1.4 million, representing their shares of the net proceeds after legal fees and closing costs had been deducted. My check was noticeably smaller, totaling exactly $3,000. Morrison explained that this amount represented my proportional share, after accounting for various estate debts and obligations that had reduced the distributable proceeds. The calculation had been based on the assumption that I had contributed nothing of value to the Vineyard's operations, and therefore deserved only a minimal share of the liquidation proceeds. The mathematical precision of the insult was devastating. $3,000 represented less than 0.1% of the total sale price, a sum so small that it felt more like a deliberate humiliation than a genuine attempt to provide fair compensation. The amount was barely sufficient to cover a few months of basic living expenses. Certainly not enough to provide any meaningful financial security or opportunity for future investment. Marcus handed me the check with an expression that combined pity and dismissal. His comment about, quote, "your share of Nana's worthless dirt patch," was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who genuinely believed he was being generous by including me in the distribution at all. The words struck me with physical force, not because they were unexpected, but because they crystallized years of accumulated dismissal and marginalization into a single moment of absolute clarity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As I stared at the check, I realized that this was not simply a financial transaction but rather a definitive statement about my place within the family hierarchy. Marcus and Sophia viewed me as someone whose contributions had been so insignificant that I deserved only token recognition, someone whose emotional attachment to the Vineyard was quaint but ultimately irrelevant to serious business decisions. The meeting concluded with handshakes and expressions of mutual satisfaction from the buyer and my siblings. Morrison mentioned that Consolidated Agricultural Holdings planned to begin preliminary site preparation within 60 days. With full development beginning after the completion of environmental assessments and permitting processes. The timeline suggested that the Vineyard's transformation from agricultural land to residential subdivision would proceed rapidly once ownership had been transferred. Walking back to the parking lot, I felt as though I was experiencing some form of emotional dissociation, as if I were observing these events from outside my own body. The check in my hand felt weightless, almost imaginary. A piece of paper that represented the complete dissolution of everything I had believed about family loyalty and shared values. Marcus and Sophia were already discussing their plans for investing their proceeds, comparing strategies for tax optimization and portfolio diversification, with the casual expertise of people who had always expected financial success. They seemed genuinely pleased with the outcome of the sale, viewing it as a successful resolution to a complicated family situation that had been resolved through practical decision-making rather than emotional attachment. As they drove away in their luxury vehicles, I remained standing beside my Honda Civic, staring at the check that represented the supposed value of 15 years of dedicated work, countless hours of learning traditional winemaking techniques, and an emotional investment in preserving family legacy that my siblings had never understood or appreciated. The devastating realization that began to crystallize during those moments in the parking lot was not simply that I had been financially cheated, although the monetary disparity was certainly painful. The deeper wound was the recognition that Marcus and Sophia had never considered me a legitimate stakeholder in family decisions, despite my years of involvement with the Vineyard's operations. They had not consulted me about the sale because they genuinely believed that my opinions were irrelevant to important business decisions. They had not investigated the full scope of the Vineyard's assets because they assumed that anything I might know about the operations would be too insignificant to affect the property's value. They had excluded me from meaningful participation in estate planning because they viewed me as someone whose role was to accept decisions made by more qualified family members. Standing alone in that parking lot, holding a $3,000 check that represented the complete dismissal of my life's work, I experienced the kind of crystallizing moment that forces people to choose between accepting diminished expectations or fighting for recognition of their true worth. The humiliation was so complete and so carefully calculated that it eliminated any possibility of compromise or gradual resolution. For the first time in my adult life, I understood with absolute clarity that my siblings viewed me not as family member deserving respect and consideration, but as someone whose presence was tolerated rather than valued. The realization was devastating but also liberating, because it freed me from the obligation to seek their approval or acceptance of decisions I made about my own future. As I drove home through the rolling hills of Sonoma County, passing vineyards that reminded me of everything I was losing, I began to understand that this moment of complete humiliation might also represent the beginning of something entirely different. The $3,000 in my pocket was an insult, but it was also evidence of the profound miscalculation my siblings had made about the value of knowledge they had never bothered to acquire. What Marcus and Sophia had sold for $4.2 million was not simply 47 acres of agricultural land, but rather a complex business operation with distribution networks, exclusive contracts, and revenue streams that they had never investigated or understood. Their assumption that I knew nothing of value about the vineyard's operations was about to be tested in ways that would determine whether their dismissal of my expertise had been justified, or whether they had made the most expensive mistake of their lives. The war was about to begin, and I was finally ready to stop seeking their approval and start proving my worth through actions that would either establish my independence or destroy any remaining possibility of family reconciliation. Everything our grandmother had built was at stake, and I was the only person who truly understood what we were fighting to preserve. The drive back to my Sacramento apartment took 3 hours through winding country roads that felt like a funeral procession for everything I had lost. The $3,000 check sat on my passenger seat like evidence of a crime, its presence serving as constant reminder of the calculated dismissal I had just experienced. The February afternoon light filtered through bare oak trees, casting shadows that seemed to mirror the emptiness spreading through my chest. My studio apartment occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house in the Midtown district, where graduate students and struggling professionals clustered in spaces that optimized affordability over comfort. The building's landlord, Mrs. Chen, had been patient with my occasionally late rent payments, understanding that agricultural consulting work provided irregular income that fluctuated with seasonal demands and client availability. Climbing the narrow stairs to my apartment, I felt the weight of defeat settling into my bones like winter cold. The hallways smelled of cooking spices and laundry detergent, domestic scents that normally provided comfort but now seemed to emphasize how far I had fallen from the expansive possibilities that had once seemed within reach. Inside my apartment, the contrast between my current circumstances and my siblings' luxury became painfully apparent. My furniture consisted primarily of pieces rescued from garage sales and estate auctions, functional items that served their purpose without contributing to any coherent design aesthetic. The space reflected the lifestyle of someone who had been perpetually saving money for future investments, rather than spending on immediate comfort. However, what the apartment lacked in material elegance, it compensated for in intellectual resources. Every available wall surface held floor-to-ceiling bookshelves containing agricultural texts, wine industry publications, business management guides, and legal reference materials that I had accumulated during years of self-directed education. These books represented my real wealth, the knowledge base that had qualified me to work as consultant, despite lacking formal credentials from prestigious universities. The central feature of my living space was a large work table, covered with file folders, research documents, and detailed maps of California wine regions that I used for client projects. This table had served as command center for dozens of agricultural consulting assignments, where I had developed solutions for pest management problems, irrigation system failures, and crop optimization challenges that had saved clients hundreds of thousands of dollars in potential losses. My expertise had been developed through combination of theoretical study and practical experience that began during childhood visits to Bella Vista Vineyard. While other children played video games or watched television during family gatherings, I had followed my grandmother through the vineyard rows, learning to identify the subtle signs that indicated plant health, soil conditions, and optimal harvest timing. Nona Elena had possessed intuitive understanding of viticulture that transcended formal education, drawing upon knowledge that had been passed down through generations of Italian winemakers who had learned their craft through centuries of trial and refinement. She had taught me to read the landscape like a complex text, recognizing patterns and relationships that were invisible to casual observers. Under her guidance, I had learned to assess soil composition by examining root development patterns, predict weather impacts by observing bird behavior and atmospheric pressure changes, and determine grape ripeness through combination of sugar content testing and sensory evaluation that required years of experience to master. These skills had proven invaluable during my consulting work, where clients often faced problems that required understanding complex interactions between environmental factors and agricultural practices. What my siblings had never recognized was that my informal education had been supplemented by extensive formal study through online courses, industry certifications, and professional development programs that had provided me with business management skills alongside agricultural expertise. I had earned certificates in supply chain management, contract negotiation, financial analysis, and international trade regulations, all while maintaining the facade of someone who was simply playing in grandmother's garden. The motivation for this intensive self-education had been my recognition that preserving Bella Vista Vineyard would require more than traditional farming knowledge. The modern wine industry demanded sophisticated understanding of distribution networks, marketing strategies, regulatory compliance, and financial management that would enable small family operations to compete with corporate agricultural enterprises. As I sat at my work table reviewing the day's devastating events, I began to understand that my siblings' dismissal of my expertise represented more than simple family dynamics. They had made their decision based on fundamental misunderstanding of both the vineyard's true value and my qualifications to evaluate that value. Their assumption that agricultural operations were inherently unprofitable reflected ignorance about modern wine industry economics that had created opportunities for extraordinary returns when properly managed. The realization that began to crystallize as I reviewed my grandmother's business records was that Marcus and Sophia had sold the vineyard without conducting due diligence investigation that would have revealed assets and contracts they had never discovered. Their focus on immediate liquidation had prevented them from recognizing revenue streams and business relationships that could have generated far more income than the $4.2 million sale price they had accepted. My grandmother's filing system had always seemed chaotic to casual observers, with important documents scattered across multiple locations and filing categories that reflected her intuitive organizational methods rather than conventional business practices. However, during the months following her death, I had spent countless hours cataloging and analyzing these records, gradually uncovering the sophisticated business operation she had developed over decades of careful planning and strategic investment. The first major discovery had been a series of distribution agreements with premium restaurants and wine retailers throughout Northern California that guaranteed minimum purchase volumes at prices significantly above wholesale market rates. These contracts had been negotiated during the early 2000s when Bella Vista wine was still relatively unknown, but they included escalation clauses that adjusted pricing based on market recognition and quality ratings that had improved dramatically over the past 2 decades. The financial impact of these distribution agreements was substantial. Conservative calculations suggested they generated approximately $800,000 in annual revenue that was guaranteed regardless of harvest variations or market fluctuations. The contracts also included exclusivity provisions that prevented restaurants from purchasing similar varietals from competing vineyards, effectively creating monopoly market position for specific wine categories. Even more significant were the international export contracts that my grandmother had established with distributors in Japan, South Korea, and several European markets where California wines commanded premium pricing due to perceived quality and authenticity. These agreements had taken years to negotiate and required compliance with complex regulatory standards that created substantial barriers to entry for competing producers. The international contracts were particularly valuable because they were denominated in foreign currencies, providing natural hedge against dollar fluctuations while generating revenue streams that were largely independent of domestic market conditions. The agreements also included provisions for expansion into additional markets as production capacity increased, creating scalable growth opportunities that could multiply revenue generation over time. Perhaps most importantly, I had discovered that my grandmother had been systematically investing in vineyard improvements and equipment upgrades that would dramatically increase production capacity and wine quality over the next 5 to 10 years. These investments included soil enhancement programs, advanced irrigation systems, temperature-controlled fermentation facilities, and aging infrastructure that would enable production of premium wines commanding substantially higher prices than current offerings. The timing of these investments reflected my grandmother's sophisticated understanding of wine industry cycles and market development patterns. She had anticipated growing demand for premium California wines in Asian markets, and had positioned Bella Vista Vineyard to capitalize on opportunities that were just beginning to emerge, as her health declined and prevented her from implementing the full scope of her expansion plans. The documentation for these investments and future projections filled 3 large file boxes that my siblings had never examined, assuming they contained routine paperwork rather than strategic business plans worth millions of dollars. The oversight was understandable given their lack of agricultural industry knowledge, but it represented catastrophic failure to conduct proper due diligence before making irreversible decisions about asset disposition. As I reviewed financial projections and market analysis documents that my grandmother had prepared with help from industry consultants, I began to understand the true magnitude of what had been lost through the hasty sale to Consolidated Agricultural Holdings. Conservative estimates suggested the vineyard's value should have been assessed at $12 to $15 million, based solely on existing contracts and infrastructure improvements, not including the potential upside from expansion plans and market development initiatives. The $3,000 check that represented my share of the liquidation proceeds was not simply inadequate compensation, but rather evidence of the profound miscalculation that had occurred when business decisions were made by people who lacked relevant expertise and had no understanding of the assets they were disposing of. However, the most devastating aspect of reviewing these documents was the realization that my grandmother had been preparing to transfer operational control of the vineyard to me during the months before her death. Her notes included detailed succession plans that would have provided me with management authority, while ensuring that Marcus and Sophia received fair financial compensation for their inherited interests, without requiring liquidation of the underlying business operation. The succession plan had been structured to recognize my unique qualifications and emotional investment in the vineyard's continued operation, while addressing my siblings' preference for immediate financial return rather than long-term agricultural involvement. The arrangement would have enabled everyone's interest to be satisfied without destroying the business enterprise that had been built over 4 generations of family stewardship. My grandmother's declining health had prevented her from finalizing these succession arrangements before Marcus and Sophia obtained power of attorney authorization and began pursuing immediate liquidation. The timing had been particularly unfortunate because she had been in advanced negotiations with several potential partners who were interested in providing capital investment for expansion plans that could have doubled or tripled the vineyard's revenue generation within 5 years. The discovery of these succession plans and partnership opportunities created emotional devastation that went beyond simple financial loss. My grandmother had recognized my qualifications and had been actively working to ensure that her life's work would be preserved and developed by someone who understood its true value and potential. Her death had prevented her from protecting the vineyard from siblings who viewed it as burden rather than opportunity. Sitting alone in my cramped apartment, surrounded by evidence of opportunities that had been destroyed through ignorance and impatience, I experienced the kind of crystallizing anger that eliminates self-doubt and creates absolute determination to fight for justice. The humiliation inflicted by Marcus and Sophia had been predicated on their assumption that I lacked knowledge and capabilities necessary to challenge their decisions. But their assumption was about to be tested in ways they had never anticipated. The $3,000 check they had given me was intended as dismissal, a token payment designed to eliminate any claims I might have on estate assets, while providing them with legal protection against future challenges. However, what they had actually provided was evidence of the fraudulent undervaluation that had occurred when they sold assets without proper investigation or expert consultation. More importantly, their hasty sale had created time pressure that might work to my advantage if I could develop strategy for challenging the transaction before Consolidated Agricultural Holdings completed their acquisition and began irreversible development activities. The 60-day timeline Morrison had mentioned for preliminary site preparation suggested that legal challenges needed to be initiated immediately if there was any possibility of preventing the vineyard's destruction. The realization that began to form as I reviewed legal documents and contract provisions was that my siblings might have unknowingly violated fiduciary duties they owed to estate beneficiaries by failing to conduct proper valuation analysis before disposing of inherited assets. Their power of attorney authorization might not have provided legal authority for decisions that resulted in substantial financial losses due to inadequate investigation and professional consultation. Even more promising was the possibility that the sale contract with Consolidated Agricultural Holdings might be voidable, if it could be demonstrated that the purchase price was so far below fair market value that it constituted unconscionable transaction. The company's willingness to proceed rapidly with development activities suggested they understood they had obtained valuable property at substantially below market pricing. The legal research required to evaluate these possibilities would demand expertise I did not currently possess, but the potential financial stakes justified significant investment in professional consultation and legal representation. The challenge would be finding attorneys who understood both real estate law and agricultural business valuation, while being willing to work on contingency basis that would not require upfront payments I could not afford. As evening settled over Sacramento, I realized that the devastating humiliation inflicted by my siblings had activated knowledge and determination that might never have emerged under less extreme circumstances. Their dismissal of my expertise had been so complete and so deliberately insulting that it had eliminated any possibility of compromise or gradual resolution. The war they had initiated by excluding me from meaningful participation in estate decisions would be fought with weapons they had never bothered to understand: agricultural industry knowledge, business analysis capabilities, and legal strategies that could potentially reverse their apparent victory and establish my credibility through demonstration rather than argument. The $3,000 check would become my war chest, the initial capital for legal consultation and investigation activities that would either validate their assessment of my capabilities or prove that they had made the most expensive mistake of their lives. Everything our grandmother had built was at stake, and I finally understood that seeking their approval or acceptance was far less important than proving my worth through actions that would either restore family legacy or establish my complete independence from their judgment. For the first time since childhood, I felt the emergence of strength that came not from seeking external validation, but from absolute confidence in knowledge and capabilities that had been developed through years of dedicated study and practical experience. The battle ahead would test everything I had learned, and I was finally ready to discover whether my grandmother's faith in my potential had been justified, or whether my siblings' dismissal had been an accurate assessment of my limitations. The transformation from defeated victim to determined warrior began that night, powered by anger that had crystallized into focused determination to fight for everything that mattered. The following morning brought the kind of clarity that emerges after sleepless nights spent processing devastating revelations. I sat at my work table surrounded by 3 years of financial records that painted a picture far more complex and troubling than simple family betrayal. What I had initially perceived as my siblings' ignorance about the vineyard's value was actually part of a systematic pattern of decisions that had been influenced by parties whose interests went far beyond real estate development. My deeper analysis of the sale documentation revealed that Consolidated Agricultural Holdings was not an independent buyer seeking profitable investment opportunities, but rather a subsidiary of Meridian Development Corporation, one of California's largest residential construction companies. Meridian had been systematically acquiring premium agricultural properties throughout Sonoma County as part of a comprehensive strategy to control land development in the region's most desirable locations. The implications of this discovery were staggering. Marcus and Sophia had not simply made an impulsive decision to liquidate inherited property, but had actually participated in a coordinated effort to transfer prime agricultural land from family ownership to corporate control, at prices that were deliberately structured to appear reasonable while being substantially below actual market value. The methodology employed by Meridian Development Corporation was sophisticated and systematic. Their research revealed that the company employed teams of specialists whose primary responsibility was identifying family-owned agricultural properties, where inheritance disputes, financial pressures, or generational transitions created opportunities for acquiring valuable land at reduced prices. The strategy involved multiple stages of preparation and manipulation that were designed to create circumstances favorable to corporate acquisition, while maintaining legal compliance and avoiding obvious evidence of fraudulent practices. The first stage involved comprehensive research into family dynamics, financial circumstances, and property ownership structures that identified potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited during negotiation processes. The second stage involved establishing relationships with estate attorneys, financial advisors, and other professionals who could influence family decision-making by providing advice that favored immediate liquidation over long-term property retention. These professionals received consulting fees, referral payments, and other financial incentives that created conflicts of interest while maintaining appearances of independent professional judgment. The third stage involved presenting purchase offers that were structured to appear generous when compared to artificially low property valuations that had been prepared by appraisers who specialized in agricultural property assessments for development companies. These appraisals systematically undervalued revenue-generating assets, future development potential, and unique market advantages that made properties worth substantially more than basic land valuations suggested. The documentation I discovered revealed that Margaret Henderson, the estate attorney who had handled our grandmother's affairs, had received retainer payments from Meridian Development Corporation dating back 3 years, long before our grandmother's death had created the inheritance situation that led to the Vineyard's sale. Henderson's legal advice had consistently favored immediate liquidation over alternative arrangements that would have preserved family ownership while providing financial benefits to all beneficiaries. Similarly, the property appraisal that had established the $4.2 million sale price had been prepared by Richardson Associates, an appraisal firm that derived more than 60% of its revenue from development companies seeking to acquire agricultural properties for conversion to residential use. The appraisal had systematically ignored distribution contracts, infrastructure improvements, and market positioning advantages that should have been included in comprehensive property valuation. The financial analysis that had convinced Marcus and Sophia to accept the sale offer had been prepared by Thomas Financial Services, a consulting firm that specialized in estate planning for families with significant agricultural holdings. The analysis had projected declining profitability for California wine industry operations, while recommending immediate asset liquidation as optimal strategy for maximizing inheritance value for beneficiaries who lacked agricultural expertise. The coordination between these various professional service providers suggested a level of systematic manipulation that went far beyond individual conflicts of interest or professional incompetence. Meridian Development Corporation had created an entire ecosystem of advisors and specialists whose financial incentives were aligned with corporate acquisition objectives rather than client interests, ensuring that family decision-making would be influenced toward outcomes that benefited the development company. Even more disturbing was my discovery that this pattern had been replicated across dozens of similar transactions throughout Northern California over the past 5 years. Meridian had acquired more than 2,000 acres of premium agricultural land through transactions that followed identical patterns of professional coordination, family influence, and systematic undervaluation that had characterized the Bella Vista Vineyard sale. The scale of this operation suggested that what I had experienced was not an isolated incident of corporate opportunism, but rather a component of deliberate strategy to consolidate ownership of California's most valuable agricultural properties under corporate control. The implications extended far beyond individual family losses to encompass fundamental changes in land ownership patterns that would reshape entire regional economies and agricultural traditions. The investigation also revealed that Consolidated Agricultural Holdings had no intention of developing the vineyard property for residential use, despite the representations made during the sale process. Internal communications that I obtained through public records requests showed that the company planned to operate Bella Vista Vineyard as commercial wine production facility, while eliminating the distribution contracts and market relationships that had made the property uniquely valuable. The development company's actual strategy involved consolidating multiple vineyard acquisitions into single large-scale operation that would benefit from economies of scale, while eliminating the premium pricing and market positioning that small family operations had achieved through decades of careful cultivation and relationship building. The residential development narrative had been used primarily to justify rapid acquisition timelines and to discourage families from conducting thorough investigation of alternative options. This revelation transformed my understanding of what had been lost through the vineyard sale. Marcus and Sophia had not simply liquidated agricultural property that they were unqualified to manage, but had actually transferred sophisticated business enterprise to competitors who intended to eliminate the unique advantages that our family had spent generations developing. The distribution contracts that would have generated $800,000 in annual revenue were scheduled for cancellation within 6 months of the property transfer, with client relationships being redirected to other Meridian-owned facilities that could provide similar products at lower prices due to larger-scale operations. The premium market positioning that had taken decades to establish would be dissolved in favor of mass-market strategies that prioritized volume over quality and profitability. The infrastructure improvements that my grandmother had implemented to support premium wine production would be repurposed for standard commercial operations that would generate higher volumes of lower-quality products, eliminating the market differentiation that had enabled Bella Vista wines to command premium pricing in domestic and international markets. Perhaps most devastating was the realization that the international export contracts that had provided currency diversification and access to high-value Asian markets would be terminated and replaced with bulk export arrangements that would generate higher volumes at substantially lower profit margins. The relationships with distributors in Japan and South Korea that had taken years to develop and required continuous personal attention would be abandoned in favor of automated transaction processing that eliminated personal service elements that had differentiated Bella Vista wines from mass-market competitors. This systematic elimination of everything that had made Bella Vista Vineyard uniquely valuable was not accidental byproduct of corporate acquisition, but rather deliberate strategy to remove competitive threats while consolidating market share under centralized corporate control. Meridian Development Corporation was not developing real estate but rather eliminating competition, while acquiring production capacity at prices that were substantially below the value of the businesses being acquired. As I processed the full scope of what had been orchestrated through my family's inheritance situation, I began to understand that challenging the vineyard's sale would require confronting institutional systems that had been specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of legal and financial resistance I was contemplating. The estate attorney who should have protected our family's interests had been financially compromised by the acquiring company. The appraisal process that should have established fair market value had been manipulated by professionals whose income depended on undervaluing properties for development companies. The financial analysis that had influenced my siblings' decision-making had been prepared by consultants whose business model required recommending immediate liquidation rather than long-term value preservation. Even the legal framework governing estate transactions had been structured to favor rapid resolution over thorough investigation, with statutory timelines and procedural requirements that made challenging sales decisions extremely difficult once contracts had been executed and ownership transfers had been completed. The web of obstacles I faced in attempting to reverse the vineyard's sale extended beyond legal and financial challenges to encompass fundamental power imbalances between individual families and corporate entities that possessed unlimited resources for legal defense, political influence, and market manipulation. Meridian Development Corporation employed teams of attorneys who specialized in defending property acquisitions against challenges from former owners, with legal strategies that focused on procedural defenses rather than substantive evaluation of transaction fairness. The company also maintained relationships with political officials and regulatory agencies that could influence permit processes, environmental assessments, and zoning decisions that affected property development timelines. The financial resources available to corporate defendants were effectively unlimited when compared to individual plaintiffs who lacked access to capital markets and professional networks that enabled sustained legal challenges. Most families who discovered that they had been systematically defrauded during property sales lacked resources necessary to pursue complex litigation against corporate defendants who could afford to extend proceedings indefinitely through procedural motions and appeals. The psychological warfare employed by corporate legal teams was designed to exhaust individual challengers through processes that were deliberately complicated, time-consuming, and emotionally draining. The strategy relied on assumption that most people would eventually abandon legal challenges rather than endure years of expensive and uncertain litigation against defendants who were prepared to fight indefinitely. However, my analysis of previous challenges to similar transactions revealed that corporate defendants possessed significant vulnerabilities that could be exploited by plaintiffs who understood industry practices and possessed sufficient knowledge to identify procedural violations and substantive fraud that had occurred during acquisition processes. The systematic coordination between estate attorneys, appraisers, and financial advisors created extensive documentation of conflicts of interest that could be used to demonstrate pattern of professional misconduct that invalidated the advice provided to families during decision-making processes. The undervaluation of agricultural properties through biased appraisal processes created quantifiable damages that could be calculated based on subsequent property performance and comparable market transactions. Most importantly, the misrepresentation of development intentions and the systematic elimination of contract values after acquisition created evidence of fraudulent inducement that could potentially void sales contracts and require restoration of properties to original owners with compensation for damages resulting from temporary loss of control. The challenge would be assembling legal representation and financial resources necessary to pursue comprehensive litigation against defendants who possess substantial advantages in experience, resources, and political connections. The battle ahead would require strategies that overcame systematic disadvantages while exploiting specific vulnerabilities that corporate defendants might not anticipate from individual challengers. The transformation of my situation from simple family dispute to systematic corporate fraud investigation changed both the stakes involved and the strategies required for successful resolution. What had begun as effort to challenge my siblings' business judgment had evolved into campaign against institutional corruption that threatened agricultural traditions and family ownership patterns throughout California. The $3,000 check that had represented humiliating dismissal was about to become the initial capital for legal and investigative efforts that would either expose systematic fraud or demonstrate that individual families were powerless against corporate entities that had captured the professional and regulatory systems that were supposed to protect property owners from predatory acquisition practices. The scope of the battle ahead was intimidating, but the magnitude of what had been stolen through coordinated manipulation created determination that transcended personal interest and encompassed defense of principles that were fundamental to agricultural tradition and family enterprise preservation. The breakthrough in my investigation came from an unexpected source on a Thursday morning when Mrs. Chen knocked on my apartment door with unusual urgency. She held an envelope that had been delivered by courier service, marked with legal return address that I did not recognize. The sender was identified as Dr. Victoria Castellano, attorney at law, with offices in San Francisco, and a notation that the correspondence was both confidential and time-sensitive. Inside the envelope was a letter written on letterhead that conveyed both professional authority and personal attention to detail. Dr. Castellano explained that she had been monitoring public records related to agricultural property transactions throughout Northern California as part of ongoing research into corporate acquisition patterns that had raised concerns among legal professionals who specialized in estate planning and agricultural law. The letter indicated that my grandmother's estate transaction had triggered several automated alerts within monitoring systems that Dr. Castellano used to identify potentially fraudulent property transfers. The combination of rapid sale timeline, below-market pricing, and involvement of professional service providers who had been associated with previous questionable transactions had generated sufficient red flags to warrant personal investigation. Dr. Castellano requested a meeting to discuss my family's experience with the Vineyard sale, and to explore whether legal remedies might be available to address what appeared to be systematic violation of fiduciary duties owed to estate beneficiaries. The letter emphasized that initial consultation would be provided without charge and that any subsequent legal representation would be structured to align attorney compensation with successful recovery of damages rather than requiring upfront payments. The timing of this unexpected contact felt almost supernatural, arriving precisely when my own investigation had revealed the scope of institutional corruption that had orchestrated the Vineyard's sale while my resources for challenging the transaction remained severely limited. The possibility that experienced legal professional might be willing to provide assistance without requiring immediate payment created the first genuine hope I had experienced since discovering the true circumstances surrounding our family's property loss. Dr. Castellano's offices occupied the 32nd floor of a downtown San Francisco building that commanded panoramic views of the Bay Area and projected the kind of professional credibility that would be essential for challenging corporate defendants with unlimited legal resources. The reception area featured awards and recognition certificates that documented decades of successful representation in complex litigation involving agricultural property disputes and corporate fraud cases. When I met Dr. Castellano in person, her presence immediately conveyed the combination of intellectual sophistication and practical determination that would be necessary for confronting the systematic obstacles I had discovered. She appeared to be in her early 60s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes that suggested someone who had spent years developing expertise in areas where most attorneys lacked sufficient specialization to provide effective representation. Her initial questions focused on my background and qualifications for evaluating the vineyard's operations and market value, probing to understand whether my assessment of the property's worth was based on genuine expertise or emotional attachment that might not withstand professional scrutiny. The examination was thorough but not condescending, reflecting genuine interest in determining whether my claims had sufficient merit to justify significant investment of time and resources. When I presented the financial analysis and contract documentation that I had compiled during my investigation, Dr. Castellano's reaction confirmed that my assessment of the systematic fraud had been accurate, and that the evidence I had gathered would be sufficient to support comprehensive legal challenge to the property sale. Her evaluation of the distribution contracts and international agreements was particularly encouraging, as she immediately recognized their significance and confirmed that their value had been systematically ignored during the estate appraisal process. However, Dr. Castellano also explained that challenging the vineyard sale would require confronting legal and procedural obstacles that were specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of action I was contemplating. The estate settlement process had been structured to create tight timelines for challenging property dispositions, and corporate defendants would use every available procedural defense to delay substantive evaluation of transaction fairness until statutory deadlines had expired. The conversation revealed that Dr. Castellano had been investigating Meridian Development Corporation's acquisition practices for more than 2 years, as part of broader research into systematic corporate fraud targeting family-owned agricultural properties throughout California. Her work had identified patterns of professional coordination and deliberate undervaluation that had resulted in the transfer of more than 50,000 acres of prime agricultural land, from family ownership to corporate control, at prices that were substantially below fair market value. The scope of Dr. Castellano's investigation provided context that transformed my family's experience from isolated incident of corporate opportunism into component of comprehensive strategy to reshape California agricultural ownership patterns through systematic exploitation of inheritance processes and family financial pressures. The legal implications extended far beyond individual property recovery to encompass fundamental questions about fiduciary responsibility and regulatory oversight that had enabled predatory acquisition practices to operate without effective challenge. Dr. Castellano explained that successful litigation against Meridian Development Corporation would require comprehensive strategy that addressed multiple levels of misconduct, while anticipating defense tactics that had been developed through years of experience defending similar challenges. The corporate legal team would focus on procedural defenses that avoided substantive evaluation of transaction fairness, requiring plaintiff strategies that forced examination of underlying fraud while meeting all technical requirements for challenging completed property transfers. The financial resources required for pursuing comprehensive litigation against well-funded corporate defendants would be substantial, involving expert witness testimony, extensive document discovery, and prolonged court proceedings that could extend over several years. However, Dr. Castellano indicated that she was prepared to provide representation on contingency basis that would align attorney compensation with successful recovery, while minimizing immediate financial burden on clients who lacked resources for upfront legal expenses. More importantly, Dr. Castellano revealed that she had been developing coalition of families who had experienced similar systematic fraud during agricultural property transactions, creating opportunity for coordinated legal action that would provide economies of scale while strengthening individual cases through demonstration of systematic corporate misconduct patterns. The coalition approach would enable sharing of investigation costs and expert witness expenses, while creating political pressure for regulatory reforms that would prevent future occurrences of similar fraud. The coalition included families from throughout Northern California who had lost vineyard properties, organic farming operations, and specialty agricultural businesses through transactions that followed identical patterns of professional coordination and systematic undervaluation. The combined value of properties that had been transferred through fraudulent processes exceeded $200 million, creating potential damage claims that would justify significant investment in comprehensive litigation, while generating sufficient political attention to encourage regulatory intervention. Dr. Castellano's strategy involved coordinating individual property recovery lawsuits with broader pattern and practice litigation that would challenge the systematic corruption of professional service providers who had facilitated fraudulent transactions. The dual approach would create multiple pathways for recovery, while addressing institutional problems that had enabled corporate acquisition schemes to operate without effective oversight or accountability. The legal theory underlying the comprehensive challenge would focus on conspiracy claims that demonstrated coordination between estate attorneys, appraisers, financial advisors, and corporate acquirers to defraud property owners through systematic manipulation of inheritance processes. The conspiracy approach would enable recovery of punitive damages while establishing precedent that would deter future occurrences of similar systematic fraud. However, Dr. Castellano also emphasized that successful litigation would require plaintiff families to demonstrate sophisticated understanding of agricultural business operations and property valuation methods that would enable them to provide credible testimony about the systematic undervaluation that had occurred during their property transactions. The corporate defendants would challenge every aspect of plaintiff damage claims, requiring detailed documentation and expert analysis that supported assertions about actual property values and revenue generation potential. The conversation revealed that my extensive self-education in agricultural business management and wine industry operations would be crucial for establishing credibility of damage claims, while distinguishing my case from other families who lacked technical expertise necessary to challenge professional appraisal and financial analysis that had been used to justify below-market sale prices. My ability to provide detailed analysis of distribution contracts and market positioning advantages would be essential for demonstrating the specific elements of value that had been systematically ignored during the estate settlement process. Dr. Castellano's evaluation of my qualifications and evidence collection efforts confirmed that my case possessed several advantages that would strengthen the overall coalition effort while providing strong foundation for individual property recovery. The combination of documented professional misconduct, quantifiable damage calculations, and credible plaintiff testimony would create favorable conditions for successful litigation outcomes, while contributing to broader pattern demonstration that would benefit all coalition participants. The mentorship relationship that emerged from our initial meeting extended beyond traditional attorney-client representation to encompass comprehensive education about legal strategy, corporate litigation tactics, and agricultural property valuation methods that would enable me to participate effectively in complex proceedings while understanding the broader implications of systematic fraud that had targeted family agricultural operations throughout California. Dr. Castellano explained that successful challengers in corporate fraud cases required more than legal representation, needing strategic guidance about media relations, political advocacy, and coalition building that would create multiple forms of pressure on corporate defendants while building public support for regulatory reforms that would prevent future occurrences of similar systematic exploitation. The educational process would involve intensive preparation in legal procedures, testimony techniques, and document analysis that would enable me to serve as effective witness while understanding the strategic considerations that would determine litigation outcomes. The preparation would also include networking with other coalition families and agricultural industry professionals who could provide additional support and expertise during the challenging process of confronting well-funded corporate defendants. Perhaps most importantly, Dr. Castellano emphasized that successful litigation against systematic corporate fraud required plaintiffs who possessed not only legal claims but also personal determination to pursue justice despite intimidation tactics and procedural obstacles that were specifically designed to exhaust individual challengers and force abandonment of legitimate claims. The psychological preparation for sustained litigation would be as important as legal strategy development in determining ultimate success. The transformation of my situation from isolated family dispute to coordinated legal challenge against systematic corporate fraud created opportunities that had not existed when I was contemplating individual action against my siblings and their corporate allies. The coalition approach would provide resources, expertise, and strategic advantages that would enable confronting institutional obstacles that would have been insurmountable for individual plaintiff acting alone. The mentorship relationship with Dr. Castellano represented more than legal representation, providing access to professional network and strategic guidance that would enable me to develop capabilities necessary for participating effectively in complex litigation while contributing to broader reform efforts that could prevent future families from experiencing the systematic fraud that had destroyed our Vineyard legacy. The unexpected arrival of experienced legal guidance at precisely the moment when my investigation had revealed the full scope of institutional corruption felt like confirmation that the battle ahead was not only winnable, but also necessary for protecting agricultural traditions and family enterprise preservation that extended far beyond my personal circumstances. The $3,000 check that had represented humiliating dismissal was about to become the initial evidence in comprehensive legal challenge that would either expose systematic fraud or demonstrate that corporate entities had successfully captured professional and regulatory systems that were supposed to protect property owners from predatory acquisition practices. The stakes had expanded beyond personal recovery to encompass fundamental questions about agricultural preservation and institutional accountability that would determine the future of family farming throughout California. The coalition headquarters occupied a converted warehouse in Oakland that Dr. Castellano had transformed into a sophisticated legal operations center designed specifically for coordinating complex litigation against corporate agricultural fraud. The facility contained research libraries, document processing systems, and secure communication networks that enabled comprehensive case development while maintaining confidentiality protocols necessary for challenging defendants who possessed extensive resources for intelligence gathering and litigation defense. During my first visit to the coalition headquarters, I encountered 17 other families who had experienced systematic fraud during agricultural property transactions that followed patterns identical to the Bella Vista Vineyard sale. The diversity of backgrounds and circumstances represented in the group demonstrated that corporate acquisition schemes had targeted properties ranging from small organic farms to major commercial operations, suggesting that the systematic fraud extended across all segments of California's agricultural economy. The introductory presentations revealed that each family had experienced similar patterns of professional coordination, systematic undervaluation, and rapid transaction timelines that had prevented thorough investigation of property values and alternative disposition options. However, the specific methods employed had been customized to exploit individual family vulnerabilities, inheritance circumstances, and financial pressures that created optimal conditions for corporate acquisition at below-market prices. Dr. Castellano's strategic approach required each coalition family to develop comprehensive understanding of legal procedures, evidence analysis techniques, and testimony preparation methods that would enable effective participation in complex litigation while maintaining unified messaging and coordinated tactical implementation. The educational process was intensive and demanding, requiring substantial time investment and intellectual commitment that would prepare participants for confronting sophisticated corporate defense strategies. The foundation building process began with detailed analysis of each family's transaction documents, property records, and financial circumstances that would enable development of individual damage calculations while identifying common patterns of misconduct that supported broader conspiracy claims. The document analysis required systematic review of thousands of pages of contracts, correspondence, and financial records that documented the coordination between estate attorneys, appraisers, and corporate representatives. My role within the coalition effort was enhanced by the agricultural expertise and business analysis capabilities that I had developed through years of self-directed education and practical consulting experience. Dr. Castellano recognized that my technical knowledge would be crucial for challenging professional appraisal methods and financial projections that had been used to justify systematic undervaluation of agricultural properties throughout the coalition cases. The strategic planning process revealed that successful litigation would require coordinated implementation across multiple jurisdictions and court systems, with individual property recovery lawsuits proceeding simultaneously with broader pattern and practice litigation that challenged the systematic corruption of professional service providers. The complexity of coordinating these parallel proceedings demanded sophisticated case management systems and communication protocols that ensured consistent strategic implementation while maintaining flexibility for tactical adjustments based on emerging developments. The coalition's investigation capabilities were dramatically enhanced through partnerships with investigative journalists, academic researchers, and regulatory specialists who had been monitoring corporate agricultural acquisition patterns as part of broader studies into changing ownership structures within California's agricultural economy. These partnerships provided access to research resources and analytical expertise that would have been prohibitively expensive for individual families, while creating opportunities for media coverage and political attention that would generate additional pressure on corporate defendants. The financial structure supporting the coalition effort was based on contingency fee arrangements that aligned attorney compensation with successful recovery outcomes, while incorporating investment from specialized litigation funding sources that provided capital for expert witness fees, document discovery costs, and extended court proceedings. The funding arrangements enabled comprehensive case development without requiring upfront payments from families who had already suffered significant financial losses through fraudulent property transactions. However, the most crucial aspect of foundation building involved developing psychological preparation and emotional resilience necessary for sustaining motivation during prolonged litigation against defendants who would employ every available tactic to exhaust plaintiff determination and force abandonment of legitimate claims. Dr. Castellano emphasized that corporate defense strategies were specifically designed to exploit emotional vulnerabilities and financial pressures that typically caused individual challengers to abandon legal action before achieving substantive resolution. The preparation process included intensive training in stress management techniques, media relations protocols, and family support systems that would enable coalition participants to maintain focus and determination throughout litigation proceedings that could extend over several years. The psychological preparation also involved developing realistic expectations about litigation timelines and procedural complexities that would prevent discouragement when initial court proceedings did not produce immediate favorable outcomes. My personal preparation extended beyond general coalition training to encompass specialized development in agricultural business valuation methods, wine industry market analysis, and international trade regulations that would enable me to provide expert testimony about the specific elements of value that had been systematically ignored during the Bella Vista Vineyard appraisal process. The specialized preparation required months of intensive study with industry experts and academic specialists who could provide credible foundation for challenging corporate defense witnesses. The coalition's research capabilities revealed that Meridian Development Corporation's acquisition schemes had been facilitated by systematic corruption within multiple professional associations and regulatory agencies that were responsible for oversight of estate planning, property appraisal, and agricultural business transactions. The corruption involved financial relationships and influence networks that had compromised professional standards while enabling systematic fraud to operate without effective accountability or intervention. The investigation identified specific individuals within professional associations who had received consulting fees, board positions, and other financial benefits from Meridian Development Corporation, in exchange for establishing policies and procedures that favored rapid property liquidation over thorough valuation analysis. The systematic corruption extended to continuing education programs, professional certification processes, and ethical guidelines that had been modified to accommodate corporate acquisition objectives, rather than protecting client interests. Similarly, the investigation revealed that regulatory agencies responsible for overseeing estate settlements and property transfers had been influenced through campaign contributions, lobbying activities, and personnel exchanges that created institutional bias toward approving transactions that benefited corporate acquirers rather than protecting individual property owners from systematic fraud. The regulatory capture had been implemented gradually over several years through coordinated influence campaigns that avoided obvious conflicts of interest while achieving systematic policy changes that facilitated predatory acquisition practices. The coalition's legal strategy incorporated these findings through comprehensive conspiracy claims that challenged not only individual property transactions, but also the institutional corruption that had enabled systematic fraud to operate without effective oversight. The conspiracy approach would enable recovery of punitive damages while establishing legal precedent that would deter future occurrences of similar institutional capture and professional misconduct. The strategic implementation required coordination with federal regulatory agencies, state attorney general offices, and congressional oversight committees that possessed authority to investigate institutional corruption and implement policy reforms that would prevent future systematic exploitation of agricultural property owners. The political dimensions of the coalition effort created opportunities for legislative hearings and regulatory investigations that would generate public attention while creating additional pressure on corporate defendants to negotiate settlement agreements rather than risk extended exposure through trial proceedings. The media strategy developed by Dr. Castellano's team focused on presenting coalition cases as representative examples of broader threats to agricultural preservation and family enterprise that resonated with public concerns about corporate consolidation and rural community preservation. The messaging emphasized economic impacts on local communities, environmental consequences of converting agricultural land to residential development, and cultural losses associated with eliminating family farming traditions that had defined California's agricultural heritage for generations. The documentary evidence supporting coalition cases was extensive and compelling, including recorded communications between corporate representatives and professional service providers that demonstrated deliberate coordination to defraud property owners through systematic manipulation of inheritance processes. The recordings provided direct evidence of conspiracy that would be difficult for corporate defendants to challenge, while supporting damage calculations based on actual property values rather than fraudulent appraisals. The coalition's expert witness network included nationally recognized authorities in agricultural economics, property valuation, estate planning, and professional ethics who could provide credible testimony about industry standards and regulatory requirements that had been violated through systematic corporate acquisition schemes. The expert testimony would establish foundation for both individual damage calculations and broader pattern claims that supported comprehensive recovery and institutional reform. My development within the coalition effort transformed me from isolated individual challenger into key strategic participant, whose agricultural expertise and case-specific knowledge would be crucial for achieving successful litigation outcomes. The transformation required not only technical skill development but also leadership capabilities that would enable effective coordination with other coalition families, while maintaining focus on broader objectives that extended beyond individual property recovery. The strategic foundation that emerged from months of intensive preparation created comprehensive framework for challenging systematic corporate fraud, while building institutional reforms that would prevent future exploitation of agricultural property owners. The foundation incorporated legal strategies, financial resources, political relationships, and media capabilities that provided multiple pathways for achieving justice, while establishing precedent that would protect future generations of family farmers from predatory acquisition schemes. The coalition effort represented unprecedented coordination between individual families, legal professionals, investigative journalists, and political advocates who shared commitment to preserving agricultural traditions while challenging corporate consolidation that threatened rural communities and environmental sustainability. The scope of the coalition's mission extended far beyond individual property recovery to encompass fundamental questions about economic justice and institutional accountability that would determine the future direction of American agricultural policy. The $3,000 check that had initially represented humiliating dismissal had become evidence in comprehensive legal challenge that would either expose systematic institutional corruption or demonstrate that corporate entities had successfully captured professional and regulatory systems that were supposed to protect individual property owners from predatory acquisition practices. The stakes had expanded beyond personal recovery to encompass preservation of agricultural heritage and family enterprise traditions that defined California's cultural and economic identity. The first major breakthrough in our coalition's legal campaign emerged from an unexpected source during the third week of our intensive preparation period. Dr. Castellano received a confidential communication from a former Meridian Development Corporation employee whose conscience had been troubled by the systematic fraud she had witnessed during her tenure as Senior Acquisitions Coordinator for the company's agricultural property division. Amanda Richardson had worked for Meridian for 4 years, before resigning in protest over practices that violated professional ethics and legal standards governing corporate real estate transactions. Her departure had been precipitated by direct instructions from company executives to falsify property valuation reports and coordinate with estate attorneys to pressure families into accepting below-market sale prices through deliberate misrepresentation of market conditions and development alternatives. Richardson's decision to become a whistleblower was motivated by recognition that her continued silence would enable ongoing exploitation of families who trusted professional advisors to protect their interests during vulnerable inheritance situations. Her documentation included internal corporate communications, training materials for acquisition staff, and detailed protocols for identifying and exploiting family vulnerabilities that could facilitate rapid property transfers at artificially reduced prices. The whistleblower evidence provided unprecedented insight into corporate strategies that had been developed through years of systematic refinement and implementation across multiple geographic markets. The documentation revealed that Meridian had invested substantial resources in developing psychological profiles and manipulation techniques specifically designed to overcome family resistance to property liquidation while maintaining appearances of legitimate business practices. The company's internal training materials included detailed instructions for estate attorneys and financial advisors who had been recruited to provide services that appeared independent while actually advancing corporate acquisition objectives. The training emphasized methods for creating artificial time pressure, presenting misleading market analysis, and discouraging families from seeking second opinions or conducting independent property valuations that might reveal systematic undervaluation. Richardson's evidence also documented the financial incentive structures that had been established to ensure professional service provider cooperation with corporate acquisition schemes. Estate attorneys received bonus payments for completing property transfers within specified timelines, while appraisers were provided with preferred vendor status and guaranteed minimum annual revenue, in exchange for producing valuations that supported predetermined sale prices. The systematic nature of professional corruption revealed through Richardson's documentation exceeded even Dr. Castellano's previous understanding of institutional capture within California's agricultural property market. The evidence demonstrated that Meridian had essentially created parallel professional service networks that provided appearance of independent advice while actually functioning as corporate acquisition facilitators whose primary loyalty was to company profits rather than client interests. The legal implications of Richardson's revelations transformed our coalition's strategic position from challenging individual transaction irregularities to prosecuting comprehensive conspiracy that involved multiple levels of professional misconduct and systematic violation of fiduciary duties owed to property owners. The whistleblower evidence provided foundation for both criminal referrals and civil litigation that could result in substantial damage awards while establishing precedent that would prevent future systematic exploitation. Dr. Castellano's immediate response to Richardson's evidence involved coordinating with federal investigative agencies that possessed jurisdiction over interstate commercial fraud and professional licensing violations that had enabled Meridian's acquisition schemes to operate across multiple state boundaries. The federal involvement created opportunities for criminal prosecution and regulatory enforcement that would complement civil litigation while generating political pressure for comprehensive industry reforms. The coalition's first strategic implementation of Richardson's evidence focused on obtaining preliminary injunctions that would prevent Meridian Development Corporation from proceeding with development activities on recently acquired properties while litigation was pending. The injunction strategy was designed to preserve property values and prevent irreversible environmental damage that would eliminate possibilities for restoration to agricultural use if court proceedings ultimately favored coalition plaintiffs. My specific role in implementing the injunction strategy involved providing detailed technical analysis of agricultural infrastructure and environmental conditions that would be destroyed through residential development activities. The analysis required comprehensive documentation of soil quality, irrigation systems, grapevine maturity, and specialized equipment that represented irreplaceable investments in premium wine production capabilities. The preparation of expert testimony regarding Bella Vista Vineyard's unique agricultural characteristics required intensive collaboration with soil scientists, viticulture specialists, and agricultural economists who could provide credible foundation for damage calculations based on replacement costs and revenue generation potential. The expert analysis confirmed that the vineyard's development would result in permanent destruction of agricultural assets worth substantially more than the $4.2 million sale price that had been accepted by my siblings. The court proceedings for obtaining preliminary injunctions provided our coalition's first opportunity to present evidence publicly, while testing judicial receptivity to arguments about systematic corporate fraud and professional misconduct. The proceedings also created media attention that generated public awareness about threats to agricultural preservation and family enterprise that resonated with environmental advocates and rural community supporters. The initial court hearings revealed that Meridian Development Corporation's legal team had been preparing for exactly this type of challenge through development of standardized defense strategies that emphasized procedural technicalities rather than substantive evaluation of transaction fairness. The corporate attorneys focused on statutory deadlines, standing requirements, and jurisdictional issues that were designed to prevent examination of underlying fraud while protecting client interests through procedural dismissal of plaintiff claims. However, Richardson's whistleblower evidence provided foundation for overcoming procedural defenses through demonstration of ongoing conspiracy that created continuing violations rather than completed transactions that might be protected by statutory limitations. The continuing conspiracy theory enabled courts to examine substantive fraud issues while maintaining jurisdiction over cases that might otherwise have been dismissed on procedural grounds. The preliminary injunction hearings also provided opportunity to present evidence about systematic professional misconduct that had compromised the integrity of estate settlement processes throughout California's agricultural regions. The evidence demonstrated that individual property transactions were components of broader institutional corruption that threatened fundamental principles of fiduciary responsibility and professional accountability. Judge Patricia Morrison, who presided over the consolidated preliminary injunction proceedings, expressed significant concern about evidence suggesting systematic corruption of professional associations and regulatory agencies that were responsible for protecting property owners from fraudulent acquisition schemes. Her questioning during hearings indicated receptivity to arguments about institutional reform that extended beyond individual property recovery to encompass comprehensive regulatory enforcement and professional discipline. The judicial response to coalition evidence exceeded expectations and provided foundation for strategic expansion beyond initial property recovery objectives toward comprehensive challenge of institutional corruption that had enabled systematic fraud to operate without effective oversight. The favorable judicial reception also created momentum for media coverage and political attention that would generate additional pressure on corporate defendants to negotiate resolution rather than risk extended exposure through trial proceedings. The preliminary injunction proceedings culminated in comprehensive court orders that halted development activities on all coalition properties while litigation was pending, preserved agricultural infrastructure and environmental conditions necessary for potential restoration to family ownership, and required corporate defendants to maintain detailed records of all activities related to acquired properties that might affect future damage calculations. The court orders represented significant strategic victory that demonstrated judicial recognition of coalition arguments while creating tactical advantages for subsequent litigation phases. The injunctions also generated substantial financial pressure on Meridian Development Corporation through delays in development timelines and increased carrying costs for properties that could not be developed while legal challenges were pending. The media coverage surrounding successful injunction proceedings created public awareness about systematic threats to agricultural preservation and family enterprise that generated political support for legislative hearings and regulatory investigations. The coverage emphasized economic impacts on rural communities, environmental consequences of converting agricultural land to residential development, and cultural significance of preserving family farming traditions that had defined California's agricultural heritage. The coalition's initial strategic victory created momentum for expanded investigation and legal action that attracted additional families who had experienced similar systematic fraud during agricultural property transactions. The expanded coalition created opportunities for economies of scale in litigation expenses while strengthening pattern evidence that supported comprehensive conspiracy claims and institutional reform objectives. The success of preliminary injunction proceedings also attracted attention from national agricultural preservation organizations, environmental advocacy groups, and rural community development agencies that recognized coalition cases as representative examples of broader threats to agricultural sustainability and family enterprise preservation. The expanded support network created additional resources and expertise while generating political pressure for federal investigation and regulatory enforcement. Richardson's continued cooperation with coalition investigation efforts provided ongoing access to corporate documentation and personnel information that enabled expansion of conspiracy claims to include additional professional service providers and corporate entities that had participated in systematic fraud schemes. The expanded investigation revealed coordination between multiple development companies that had shared strategies and resources for acquiring agricultural properties through similar manipulation of inheritance processes. The strategic implementation of Richardson's evidence also created opportunities for criminal referrals to federal prosecutors who possessed authority to pursue conspiracy charges and professional licensing violations that would complement civil litigation while establishing criminal liability for systematic fraud. The criminal referrals generated additional pressure on professional service providers to cooperate with coalition investigation rather than risk personal liability for participation in corporate acquisition schemes. My personal involvement in strategic victory implementation enhanced my understanding of legal procedures and courtroom dynamics while building confidence in my ability to provide effective testimony during future trial proceedings. The experience also demonstrated that agricultural expertise and technical knowledge could provide crucial advantages in challenging corporate defendants who lacked detailed understanding of agricultural operations and property valuation methods. The preliminary injunction victory established foundation for comprehensive litigation campaign that would challenge systematic corporate fraud while pursuing institutional reforms that would prevent future exploitation of agricultural property owners. The victory also validated Dr. Castellano's strategic approach and demonstrated that coordinated legal action could overcome procedural obstacles and institutional advantages that typically protected corporate defendants from individual challenges. The transformation of our coalition from defensive response to systematic fraud into proactive campaign for institutional reform and criminal prosecution represented fundamental shift in strategic positioning that created multiple pathways for achieving justice while establishing precedent that would protect future generations of family farmers from predatory acquisition schemes. The success demonstrated that comprehensive preparation and strategic coordination could enable individual families to challenge corporate entities that possessed substantial advantages in resources and political influence. The corporate response to our preliminary injunction victory arrived with the calculated precision of warfare, demonstrating that Meridian Development Corporation possessed both the resources and strategic sophistication necessary to escalate legal proceedings far beyond anything our coalition had previously encountered. The counterattack began at dawn on a Tuesday morning when federal marshals served search warrants on Dr. Castellano's office's coalition headquarters and the personal residences of 12 coalition families, including my Sacramento apartment. The simultaneous execution of multiple search warrants had been coordinated through corporate influence networks that enabled Meridian to obtain federal judicial authorization based on allegations that our coalition was engaged in criminal conspiracy to extort settlement payments through fraudulent claims and manufactured evidence. The criminal allegations had been supported by sworn affidavits from estate attorneys and property appraisers, who claimed that coalition families had threatened professional retaliation unless favorable testimony was provided in support of frivolous litigation claims. The search warrant executed at my apartment authorized federal agents to seize all documents, electronic devices, and communication records related to agricultural property transactions, legal proceedings, and coalition coordination activities. The scope of authorized seizure was comprehensive and invasive, designed to disrupt coalition operations while gathering intelligence about strategic planning and evidence development that could be used to anticipate and counter future legal initiatives. The psychological impact of federal law enforcement intervention was precisely calculated to achieve maximum intimidation while maintaining appearance of legitimate criminal investigation. The early morning timing, simultaneous execution across multiple locations, and extensive media coverage were designed to create public perception that coalition activities involved criminal misconduct rather than legitimate legal challenges to corporate fraud. However, the search warrant execution also revealed the extent of corporate desperation and the substantial resources that Meridian was prepared to deploy to prevent comprehensive exposure of systematic fraud schemes. The willingness to invoke federal criminal investigation procedures demonstrated that corporate defendants recognized the existential threat posed by coalition litigation, while confirming that our evidence and strategic approach had achieved sufficient effectiveness to justify extraordinary defensive measures. Dr. Castellanos' immediate response to federal intervention involved implementing security protocols that had been developed specifically for situations where corporate defendants attempted to criminalize legitimate whistleblower activities and legal challenges. The protocols included secure communication systems, document protection procedures, and media coordination strategies that would maintain coalition operations while countering narrative manipulation attempts through public relations campaigns. The coalition's response strategy emphasized that federal search warrants had been obtained through deliberate misrepresentation of coalition activities, while criminal allegations were designed to distract attention from systematic corporate fraud that had been documented through extensive evidence collection and whistleblower testimony. The strategy also highlighted that corporate defendants were attempting to use federal law enforcement resources to suppress legitimate legal challenges rather than addressing substantive fraud allegations through normal court proceedings. The media response to search warrant execution initially favored corporate narratives that portrayed coalition activities as potentially criminal rather than legitimate legal challenges to systematic fraud. However, Dr. Castellanos' strategic media coordination quickly shifted public attention toward questions about corporate influence over federal investigation priorities, while emphasizing that search warrants had been obtained without coalition families being provided opportunities to respond to allegations or present evidence about legitimate legal objectives. The federal intervention also created opportunities for exposing additional layers of corporate influence and institutional corruption that extended beyond agricultural property acquisition schemes toward comprehensive capture of regulatory and law enforcement systems that were supposed to protect individual property owners from predatory corporate practices. The coalition's investigation revealed that Meridian had systematically cultivated relationships with federal prosecutors, regulatory officials, and political representatives through campaign contributions, lobbying activities, and personnel exchanges. The systematic corruption of oversight institutions represented escalation beyond property acquisition fraud toward comprehensive subversion of legal and regulatory systems that protected individual rights and property ownership. The implications extended far beyond agricultural property transactions toward fundamental questions about institutional accountability and democratic governance that resonated with broader public concerns about corporate influence over government decision-making processes. My personal response to federal search warrant execution involved immediate implementation of security protocols that Dr. Castellano had emphasized during coalition preparation activities. The protocols included secure communication methods, document protection procedures, and legal representation coordination that would prevent disruption of coalition activities while protecting individual families from intimidation tactics and procedural manipulation. The search of my apartment revealed the extent of documentation and analysis that I had compiled regarding agricultural property valuation, wine industry market conditions, and systematic fraud patterns that supported coalition legal claims. The federal agents expressed surprise at the sophistication and comprehensiveness of evidence collection, while acknowledging that documentation appeared to support legitimate legal claims rather than fraudulent conspiracy allegations. The federal investigation also provided opportunities for coalition families to demonstrate credibility and good faith through cooperation with legitimate law enforcement inquiries, while distinguishing coalition activities from criminal misconduct allegations that had been manufactured by corporate defendants. The cooperation strategy enabled coalition families to maintain moral authority while exposing corporate manipulation of federal investigation processes. The escalation of corporate defense strategies beyond normal litigation procedures toward federal criminal allegations demonstrated that Meridian Development Corporation possessed institutional relationships and political influence that enabled systematic manipulation of law enforcement priorities. The corporate influence networks included former federal prosecutors who had transitioned to private practice representing corporate defendants, regulatory officials who had accepted lucrative consulting positions with development companies, and political representatives who had received substantial campaign contributions from agricultural acquisition schemes. The institutional corruption revealed through federal intervention exceeded even Dr. Castellano's previous understanding of corporate influence networks, and suggested that challenging systematic fraud would require confronting institutional capture that extended throughout federal regulatory and law enforcement agencies. The scope of institutional corruption created obstacles that would test coalition determination, while providing opportunities for expanding legal challenges toward comprehensive reform of regulatory oversight and corporate accountability systems. The coalition's strategic response to federal intervention involved coordinating with congressional oversight committees and federal inspector general offices that possessed authority to investigate institutional corruption and corporate influence over law enforcement priorities. The congressional coordination created opportunities for legislative hearings and oversight investigations that would generate political pressure while providing alternative pathways for addressing systematic fraud that had been enabled through regulatory capture. The federal intervention also attracted attention from national civil liberties organizations and government accountability advocacy groups that recognized coalition cases as representative examples of corporate influence over law enforcement processes that threatened fundamental principles of democratic governance and individual property rights. The expanded advocacy support created additional resources and political influence while generating media coverage that countered corporate narrative manipulation attempts. The legal implications of federal intervention required comprehensive revision of coalition litigation strategies to address both civil fraud claims and criminal defense requirements that had been created through corporate manipulation of federal investigation processes. The dual-track legal approach demanded additional resources and expertise while creating opportunities for exposing institutional corruption that extended beyond agricultural property acquisition fraud. Dr. Castellano's coordination with national legal organizations and civil liberties advocacy groups provided access to specialized expertise in federal criminal defense and government accountability litigation that would be essential for challenging institutional corruption, while maintaining focus on original objectives of property recovery and agricultural preservation. The expanded legal support network created tactical advantages while demonstrating that coalition cases had achieved national significance as representative examples of corporate influence over democratic institutions. The federal investigation also created opportunities for additional whistleblowers within Meridian Development Corporation and associated professional service providers to provide evidence about systematic fraud and institutional corruption without fear of corporate retaliation. The protection of federal investigation processes provided cover for corporate employees and professional service providers to disclose evidence about systematic misconduct, while maintaining personal security and professional credibility. Richardson's continued cooperation with coalition investigation efforts was enhanced through federal whistleblower protection programs that provided legal immunity and financial security, while encouraging additional corporate insiders to provide evidence about systematic fraud schemes. The expanded whistleblower participation created comprehensive documentation of corporate conspiracy while providing foundation for criminal prosecution and regulatory enforcement that would complement civil litigation objectives. The strategic escalation initiated by corporate defendants had inadvertently created opportunities for comprehensive exposure of institutional corruption that extended far beyond original coalition objectives toward fundamental reform of regulatory oversight and corporate accountability systems. The escalation demonstrated that systematic fraud required systematic response while confirming that coalition evidence and strategic approach had achieved sufficient effectiveness to threaten corporate interests and institutional arrangements that protected predatory acquisition schemes. The transformation of coalition legal challenges from civil litigation toward comprehensive confrontation with institutional corruption represented fundamental expansion of strategic objectives that created both opportunities and risks for individual coalition families. The expanded scope required sustained commitment and sophisticated strategic coordination, while providing possibilities for achieving institutional reforms that would protect future generations from systematic corporate exploitation. The federal intervention had been intended to intimidate coalition families into abandoning legal challenges through criminalization of legitimate activities and disruption of strategic coordination. However, the corporate escalation had actually strengthened coalition determination while providing evidence of institutional corruption that supported expanded legal challenges and political advocacy that would address systematic problems rather than individual property recovery objectives. The psychological toll of federal investigation, combined with prolonged legal proceedings, reached its breaking point during the fourth month of our coalition's expanded challenge against institutional corruption. The sustained pressure of operating under federal criminal investigation while maintaining civil litigation against well-funded corporate defendants had exhausted emotional and financial resources that individual coalition families possessed for continuing comprehensive legal confrontation. The breaking point emerged during a coalition meeting where 3 families announced their decision to withdraw from legal proceedings and accept settlement offers that Meridian Development Corporation had extended through intermediary attorneys. The settlement offers provided partial financial compensation in exchange for confidentiality agreements that would prevent families from discussing corporate fraud or institutional corruption that had enabled systematic property acquisition schemes. The family withdrawals created both tactical disadvantages for remaining coalition participants and emotional devastation for families who had invested months of intensive preparation and personal sacrifice in pursuit of justice and institutional reform. The departures suggested that corporate escalation strategies were achieving intended objectives of exhausting individual determination, while forcing abandonment of legitimate legal claims through sustained intimidation and procedural manipulation. Dr. Castellano's assessment of coalition strength following family departures indicated that remaining participants possessed sufficient legal foundation and evidentiary support to continue comprehensive litigation, but acknowledged that sustained federal investigation had created substantial additional expenses and strategic complications that would require enhanced financial resources and extended time commitments from remaining families. The federal criminal investigation had generated legal expenses exceeding $200,000 for coalition defense activities, while creating ongoing uncertainty about potential criminal liability that affected family employment, professional relationships, and financial stability. The combination of legal expenses and employment disruption had created economic pressures that many families found impossible to sustain, despite strong conviction about justice of coalition objectives. My personal financial situation had deteriorated significantly during months of coalition participation, as consulting work declined due to client concerns about federal investigation and professional reputation effects that might result from association with legal proceedings that had been characterized as potentially criminal. The loss of regular income combined with substantial legal expenses had created circumstances where continuing coalition participation threatened basic financial survival. The emotional impact of family departures and financial deterioration was compounded by growing recognition that challenging systematic institutional corruption would require years of sustained legal proceedings against defendants who possessed effectively unlimited resources for defensive litigation. The scope of institutional reform necessary to address systematic fraud extended far beyond capabilities of individual families regardless of legal merit or evidentiary strength supporting coalition claims. The psychological pressure reached its most severe point during a sleepless night when I reviewed financial projections that indicated continued coalition participation would likely result in personal bankruptcy and complete loss of professional credibility without guarantee of achieving meaningful legal victory or institutional reform. The mathematical reality suggested that pursuing justice through comprehensive litigation was financially unsustainable, regardless of moral conviction or legal merit supporting coalition objectives. The internal conflict between moral obligation to continue fighting systematic injustice and practical necessity of preserving personal survival created profound emotional crisis that challenged fundamental assumptions about effectiveness of legal systems and possibility of individual families achieving justice against institutional corruption. The crisis forced examination of whether pursuing idealistic objectives was a responsible decision when consequences threatened to destroy remaining financial security and professional prospects. The darkest moment came during early morning hours when exhaustion and despair converged into recognition that months of intensive effort and personal sacrifice might ultimately achieve nothing more than personal destruction, while corporate defendants continued operating systematic fraud schemes without meaningful accountability or institutional reform. The possibility that entire coalition effort might fail while individual participants suffered devastating personal consequences created overwhelming sense of futility and despair. However, the depth of emotional crisis also created opportunity for fundamental examination of motivations and priorities that had sustained coalition participation despite escalating obstacles and personal costs. The examination revealed that continuing legal challenge was not simply about property recovery or financial compensation, but rather about fundamental principles of institutional accountability and family enterprise preservation that transcended individual circumstances. The realization that emerged from sustained reflection was that abandoning coalition efforts would not eliminate systematic institutional corruption or prevent future families from experiencing similar systematic fraud, but would rather confirm corporate assessment that individual families could be defeated through sustained intimidation and resource exhaustion, regardless of legal merit supporting their claims. The transformation of perspective began with recognition that personal sacrifice and financial risk had been necessary components of challenging institutional systems that were specifically designed to prevent individual accountability and reform efforts. The difficulty of sustaining legal challenge against systematic corruption was not indication of futility but rather evidence of institutional arrangements that required exactly this type of sustained individual commitment to achieve meaningful reform. The renewed commitment to coalition objectives emerged from understanding that withdrawal would represent not only personal defeat, but also abandonment of responsibility to future families who would face similar systematic exploitation, unless institutional corruption was challenged and reformed through comprehensive legal proceedings. The moral obligation extended beyond personal circumstances toward broader social responsibility for protecting agricultural traditions and family enterprise preservation. The financial challenges that threatened continued coalition participation also created opportunities for developing alternative resource strategies that would enable sustained legal proceedings without requiring individual families to risk complete financial destruction. Dr. Castellanos' coordination with national legal organizations and advocacy groups had generated interest in providing additional financial support for cases that possessed broader implications for institutional reform and corporate accountability. The expanded support network included agricultural preservation organizations, environmental advocacy groups, and civil liberties organizations that recognized coalition cases as representative examples of systematic threats to democratic governance and individual property rights. The organizational support provided both financial resources and political influence that would enable sustained legal challenge while distributing costs across broader constituency that shared interest in institutional reform outcomes. The strategic revision of coalition objectives involved refocusing efforts toward achieving specific institutional reforms and regulatory enforcement outcomes that would prevent future systematic exploitation while maintaining individual property recovery as important but secondary objective. The revised approach recognized that comprehensive institutional reform would provide greater long-term benefit for agricultural preservation and family enterprise protection than individual property recovery alone. The personal transformation that emerged from sustained crisis involved development of strategic thinking that transcended immediate circumstances toward long-term implications of coalition success or failure for agricultural community preservation and institutional accountability principles. The expanded perspective provided motivation that was sustainable despite personal financial sacrifice and professional risk, because objectives extended beyond individual benefit toward broader social contribution. The coalition meeting that followed my personal crisis revealed that other remaining families had experienced similar periods of doubt and financial pressure but had reached comparable conclusions about moral obligations and strategic importance of continuing comprehensive legal challenge, despite personal costs and uncertain outcomes. The shared experience of crisis and renewed commitment created stronger foundation for sustained collaboration while demonstrating collective determination that exceeded individual capability. The renewed coalition effort incorporated lessons learned from previous months of legal proceedings while implementing enhanced security protocols, expanded financial support strategies, and revised tactical approaches that addressed institutional obstacles while maintaining focus on fundamental objectives of property recovery and systematic reform. The strategic adjustments reflected sophisticated understanding of institutional dynamics while preserving coalition determination to achieve meaningful accountability and institutional change. The federal investigation that had been intended to intimidate coalition families into abandoning legal challenges had inadvertently created additional evidence of institutional corruption while generating national attention that attracted expanded support from organizations and individuals who shared interest in challenging corporate influence over democratic institutions. The investigation had also provided opportunities for additional whistleblowers to provide evidence about systematic fraud while being protected through federal processes. The transformation of personal crisis into renewed strategic commitment represented fundamental shift from reactive response to systematic oppression toward proactive campaign for institutional reform that addressed root causes of systematic exploitation rather than individual symptoms. The shift required sustained personal sacrifice and professional risk but created possibilities for achieving comprehensive reform that would protect future generations from similar systematic exploitation. The dark night of the soul had tested fundamental convictions about justice, institutional accountability, and individual responsibility for challenging systematic corruption, despite personal costs and uncertain outcomes. The emergence from crisis with renewed commitment and enhanced strategic understanding provided foundation for sustained legal challenge that would either achieve meaningful institutional reform or demonstrate that corporate influence over democratic institutions had reached levels that prevented individual accountability through normal legal processes. The coalition's survival of intensive corporate intimidation and federal investigation while maintaining legal and strategic momentum demonstrated that systematic institutional corruption could be challenged through sustained individual commitment, despite substantial resource disadvantages and procedural obstacles that favored corporate defendants. The demonstration provided hope for broader democratic accountability, while establishing precedent for future challenges to institutional corruption and corporate influence over regulatory systems. The emergence from crisis brought clarity that transformed every aspect of my approach to the coalition's legal challenge. The sleepless nights of doubt had stripped away illusions about quick victories and simple justice, replacing them with steely determination, rooted in comprehensive understanding of institutional systems and strategic requirements for achieving meaningful reform. The transformation was profound and irreversible, converting financial consultant into institutional reformer whose expertise would become crucial for coalition success. The renewed resolve manifested first through systematic reorganization of personal resources and professional priorities that aligned all available capabilities with coalition objectives. The reorganization involved liquidating remaining personal assets to provide financial stability during extended legal proceedings, while establishing consulting practice that specialized in agricultural property fraud detection and institutional corruption analysis for families facing similar systematic exploitation. The specialized consulting practice created sustainable income stream while building expertise and professional reputation that enhanced credibility for legal testimony and media appearances related to coalition cases. The practice also provided access to additional families and professional networks that expanded evidence base supporting systematic fraud claims while generating resources for sustained legal challenge against well-funded corporate defendants. The professional transformation reflected recognition that challenging institutional corruption required comprehensive commitment rather than part-time advocacy that could be abandoned when personal circumstances became difficult. The commitment involved restructuring entire career trajectory around objectives that transcended individual financial benefit toward broader social contribution through institutional accountability and agricultural preservation. Dr. Castellano's assessment of my transformed role within coalition operations indicated that specialized expertise in agricultural property fraud detection, combined with enhanced strategic understanding of institutional dynamics, created unique qualifications for serving as primary witness and strategic coordinator for expanded legal challenge. The enhanced role reflected both personal transformation and coalition recognition that sustained success required leadership from participants who possessed comprehensive understanding of technical, legal, and strategic elements involved in comprehensive institutional reform. The strategic coordination responsibilities involved developing comprehensive case management systems that enabled effective collaboration between multiple legal teams, expert witnesses, and advocacy organizations, while maintaining consistent messaging and tactical implementation across diverse coalition participants. The coordination required sophisticated project management capabilities and institutional relationship building that had been developed through crisis experience and enhanced through specialized consulting practice. The coalition's expanded operations under my strategic coordination achieved unprecedented effectiveness through systematic integration of legal proceedings, media relations, political advocacy, and grassroots organizing that created multiple forms of pressure on corporate defendants while building public support for institutional reform objectives. The integrated approach reflected lessons learned from previous months of legal proceedings, while incorporating enhanced understanding of institutional dynamics and strategic requirements for achieving comprehensive reform. The media strategy developed under expanded coalition operations emphasized agricultural preservation and family enterprise protection themes that resonated with diverse constituencies, while highlighting specific examples of institutional corruption that created public demand for regulatory enforcement and legislative reform. The messaging strategy avoided technical legal arguments in favor of accessible narratives about threats to rural communities and democratic governance that generated broad-based political support. The political advocacy component of coalition operations involved systematic engagement with congressional oversight committees, state regulatory agencies, and federal enforcement organizations that possessed authority to investigate institutional corruption and implement policy reforms that would prevent future systematic exploitation of agricultural property owners. The advocacy efforts created multiple pathways for achieving reform while generating political pressure that complemented legal proceedings. The grassroots organizing element involved building networks of agricultural families, environmental advocates, and rural community organizations that shared interest in challenging corporate consolidation and preserving family enterprise traditions. The organizing efforts created constituent pressure for political action while providing volunteer support for coalition operations and expanded evidence collection from additional families who had experienced similar systematic fraud. The integration of these diverse strategic elements under comprehensive coordination created synergistic effects that enhanced effectiveness of individual components while providing tactical flexibility for responding to corporate defense strategies and procedural obstacles that had previously disrupted coalition momentum. The strategic integration reflected sophisticated understanding of institutional change processes while maintaining focus on fundamental objectives of property recovery and systematic reform. The federal investigation that had initially created crisis for coalition operations had been successfully reframed through strategic media coordination and political advocacy as evidence of corporate influence over law enforcement priorities rather than legitimate criminal inquiry into coalition activities. The reframing had been achieved through comprehensive documentation of corporate influence networks and systematic presentation of evidence about institutional corruption that exceeded individual property fraud to encompass broader threats to democratic governance. The successful reframing of federal investigation had created opportunities for congressional oversight hearings and federal inspector general investigations that focused attention on corporate influence over regulatory and law enforcement agencies, rather than coalition activities. The oversight investigations had generated additional evidence about institutional corruption while providing political cover for continued coalition operations, despite ongoing federal criminal investigation. The congressional oversight hearings provided national platform for presenting evidence about systematic corporate fraud and institutional corruption that had enabled predatory acquisition schemes to operate without effective accountability or regulatory enforcement. The hearings created media coverage that educated public about threats to agricultural preservation, while building political support for comprehensive regulatory reform and enhanced enforcement authority. The testimony I provided during congressional oversight hearings demonstrated agricultural expertise and institutional analysis capabilities that had been developed through crisis experience and enhanced through specialized consulting practice. The testimony received favorable media coverage and political recognition that established credibility for continued leadership role within coalition operations while generating additional consulting opportunities and professional recognition. The enhanced professional recognition created opportunities for collaboration with academic researchers, policy analysts, and institutional reform advocates who had been studying corporate influence over regulatory systems and democratic governance processes. The collaborative relationships provided additional expertise and analytical capabilities while expanding coalition influence within policy development and academic research communities. The academic collaboration generated comprehensive research studies and policy analysis that documented systematic corporate fraud patterns, while developing specific regulatory and legislative recommendations for preventing future institutional corruption. The research provided evidence base for policy advocacy, while establishing intellectual foundation for institutional reform that extended beyond individual coalition cases toward comprehensive system change. The policy development work created opportunities for participating in regulatory reform processes and legislative committee hearings that addressed corporate influence over agricultural policy and rural community development. The participation provided direct input into institutional reform, while building relationships with policymakers and regulatory officials who could implement changes that would prevent future systematic exploitation. The transformation from individual property recovery advocate into institutional reform leader had created professional opportunities and strategic influence that exceeded anything I had imagined possible when initially challenging my siblings' vineyard sale. The transformation demonstrated that crisis could create opportunities for expanded impact, while personal sacrifice could generate professional development and social contribution that transcended individual circumstances. The renewed coalition operations under enhanced strategic coordination had achieved momentum that attracted national attention from agricultural preservation organizations, environmental advocacy groups, and institutional reform movements that recognized coalition cases as representative examples of broader threats to democratic governance and rural community sustainability. The expanded attention created additional resources and political influence while demonstrating national significance of coalition objectives. The legal proceedings that had been initiated with $3,000 check and desperate hope for property recovery had evolved into comprehensive institutional reform campaign that addressed systematic corporate influence over regulatory systems while building political support for agricultural preservation and family enterprise protection. The evolution demonstrated that individual determination combined with strategic understanding could create social change opportunities that extended far beyond original objectives. The professional and personal transformation that had emerged from crisis experience created sustainable foundation for continued institutional reform work that would extend beyond current coalition cases toward broader advocacy for agricultural preservation and democratic governance accountability. The transformation established career trajectory that aligned personal fulfillment with social contribution while providing financial security and professional recognition. The coalition's success in surviving corporate intimidation, while achieving enhanced strategic effectiveness and national recognition, demonstrated that systematic institutional corruption could be challenged through sustained individual commitment and comprehensive strategic coordination. The demonstration provided inspiration for other advocacy efforts while establishing precedent for future challenges to corporate influence over regulatory systems and democratic institutions. The renewed resolve that had emerged from crisis experience created determination that transcended personal circumstances while focusing on institutional reform objectives that would protect future generations from systematic exploitation. The resolve provided emotional and strategic foundation for sustained advocacy work, while maintaining perspective that extended beyond individual benefit toward broader social contribution and democratic accountability principles. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.